O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. Amen. All right, so I'm gonna try and keep this pretty brief this morning. I know that those might not be words that you trust. They might seem a little empty, but just remember this. I am preaching twice today, so we'll just think of this as the first half of the sermon, and then the second half will come, because both times I'm supposed to be brief. Boo has threatened my eternal soul with perdition if I go too long this evening. So this is part one, and that'll be part two. What I'd like to do this morning, actually, is focus on a part of the nativity story, a part of the expectation around the Messiah that I think doesn't actually get picked up on and preached about a whole lot. At least I haven't heard a lot of sermons about it. And that is this connection of Jesus with King David. I mean, it always gets a mention, but if you noticed in our text this morning, it's all except for that one very short reading from Romans, all the other ones really pick up on this as their theme. We hear about David in our Old Testament lesson. We heard about David and his lineage in the psalm that we said together. And then in this reading of the Annunciation, we hear also that the angel Gabriel brings this up, that Jesus will be a king in the line of his ancestor David, who's of course the greatest king in Israel's history. He's kind of the way King Arthur is to England, almost mythical, this great king in Israel's history. And that's the way that David is, this kind of legendary king. When I say that, that's not to suggest that he didn't actually exist. In fact, there's very good archaeological evidence for King David. So not just what the text says, which I think is trustworthy, but also archaeologists have found evidence for David. But what I mean is that he has taken on in Israel's history more than just the meaning that's attached to being a historical figure. He's become, in Israel's history, even by the time of Jesus' day, something more than just a figure of Israel's past history. But he's taken on these kind of legendary qualities. You might even say something kind of like that is true, though to a far lesser degree, for us as Americans with George Washington and with Abraham Lincoln. These two presidents have had such a tremendous impact on our history that we almost speak of them in kind of legendary ways, even though they were real historical figures. And the same is true of David for ancient Israel and for Israel, for Jews even today. He has this kind of legendary quality. But this is actually one of the things that we see emphasized about Jesus all throughout the New Testament. I mean, even St. Paul, who doesn't tell us a whole lot about Jesus' birth. You remember the line that we get about Jesus' birth, and the only line we get about it in Paul's letters comes from Galatians chapter 4. And he says, well, Jesus was born of a woman born under the law. I don't know anyone who's not born of a woman. So that doesn't tell us a whole lot, right? And born under the law means that he was born as an Israelite, as a Jew. He was born under God's law, therefore in the covenant that God had established with his people. But the other thing that St. Paul tells us is that he was in the line, the lineage of David. That's one of the few things that Paul tells us about Jesus' birth and ancestry, is that he was in the line of David. And what we get in our Old Testament lesson this morning is this really interesting interchange between God and David through, of course, God's prophet Nathan. David is having all sorts of success as king of Israel. Things are going good for him. And he looks around at this beautiful palace that he's had built for himself there in Jerusalem. And he thinks to himself, I am living in this gorgeous palace. I'm living better than anyone else in all of the land of Israel. I have this beautiful palace in which I live. But there's no temple, there's no house for God. Because ever since the days of Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt, when they were wandering through the desert, the Lord had instructed Moses to set up a tent of tabernacle, a tent that was collapsible in which they would place the Ark of the Covenant, and that would signify the presence of God. And so God was there in the tent of the tabernacle, but it was movable. It was not a fixed structure because, of course, they were wandering around through the desert. And so even after they settled in the land of Canaan, and even after the time of the judges had passed and there had been a monarchy established, first with Saul and then with David, the Lord was still dwelling in this movable tent, this movable tabernacle. He had no fixed house, no temple. And so David looks around at this beautiful palace he's in and he says, I'm living in this beautiful house and yet there's no house for our God. I need to make a house for God. I need to have a temple built for our God. And did you pay attention to what God says through his prophet Nathan? He says to David, did I ask for a house? Did I ask for a temple? And then he says, okay, you will not build me a temple, but your lineage, your offspring will build me a temple. There will be a house for me. My presence will come and dwell with my people in a temple, but it will not be you. It will be your offspring who will do this. And historically, what we see is that King David's son Solomon, when he becomes king, he builds the temple in Israel. But what I want to suggest to you this morning is that there's another way of reading this. I'm not saying that way of reading it, that Solomon fulfilled the prophecy that there would be a temple built by one in the lineage of David. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm saying that that's the surface level reading of what's going on here. There's a higher level reading. There's a way of understanding what God is saying to David in this passage that we as Christians are able to understand and see because we look through the lens of Jesus Christ. You see, a temple is the place where a God dwells with his people. It's the place where God's presence rests. Now we know God is omnipresent, but it's a place of special presence where God is with his people, where the people can come and be with their God, be in his presence. And Solomon did build such a temple, but there was another son of David, many generations later, who was born just outside of Jerusalem, and not in a great palace, but born in the most humble of circumstances, in a place where there was nowhere else to lay him but a manger, a feeding trough for his bed. This son of David, we as Christians know, is the true temple of God. Not that the other temple's a false temple, but he is the fulfillment of that promise. For that little baby in Bethlehem, who would grow up to become the man of Nazareth, who taught and who healed and who proclaimed the gospel and who was crucified for us and for our salvation and who was raised for our justification and so that we might have participation in the everlasting life of God, in the eternal love of the Father. That child in Bethlehem, he is the temple of God. That baby, that man, that one on the cross, that one rising out of the tomb, he is the place where God's presence is on this earth. He is the one who makes God present to God's people. He did 2,000 years ago when he was born. He did when he died on the cross. He did when he rose from the grave. And he does even now. For he is here in our midst. He is here whenever 2 or 3 of us are gathered together. And it was just looking like it might be 2 or 3 of us this morning. But he's here when we are gathered together as his body. He is the temple, and we as members of his body are members of that temple also. So that where we are, God is present here on earth with us and for all those to whom we show Christian love and proclaim the gospel.